Hey guys, it's Danny. Today we're going to be discussing about rot. Might not be a pleasant subject, and I would actually prefer to show you some flowers instead of talking about this. However, it is an important subject because many of us will face it. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about root rot, stem rot, and crown rot, what they are, what causes them, how to prevent them, and maybe how to treat them, and also a few of my thoughts on the subject. Because knowing what causes them and knowing what actually killed your orchid will help you either sleep better at night or knowing how to prevent this from ever happening again. So let's start with the easiest one, which is root rot. Yes, it's the easiest rot you can have on an orchid. Now, root rot affects both monopodial orchids and sympodial orchids, both epiphyte orchids and terrestrial orchids. It's a pretty universal disease, and many plants can suffer from it. How this disease manifests? Well, it's pretty straightforward. The roots of an orchid start to die off, and because the tissue is not alive anymore, it starts to rot. So root rot is actually not a true disease in my opinion. It is the symptom of a particular phenomenon, and this is the death of the roots. Like any organic matter, once it's not alive anymore, it will start to decompose, and pretty much this is what root rot means, the decomposition of the roots after their death. But why do the roots die? Well, there can be multiple reasons. The most common of them all is suffocation. Epiphyte orchids in particular need a lot of ventilation around their root system. Because they are epiphytes, they have adapted to a way of life that does not imply a lot of humidity and compacted soil around their root system. Even though epiphyte orchids are the most prone to root rot, terrestrial orchids can obtain root rot as well. If the roots are too compacted and too suffocated in their pot, they will start to die off, and the tissue that is dead will start to decompose, will start to rot, and eventually the orchid will remain without any type of roots. For this reason, root rot doesn't necessarily imply that the infection will go upwards in the axis or the pseudobulbs. Of course, to prevent root rot, we need to make sure that an orchid has a well-draining medium, aerated medium if we're dealing with epiphytic orchids, changing the medium when it gets too old and too compacted and too acidic, because acidity can kill roots as well. Also, we make sure that we don't water too frequent, and pretty much take the necessary measures to ensure that our orchid roots do not get suffocated by medium, by too much water, or that they get affected by old medium, acidic medium, and so on. So as I was saying, root rot can happen to any type of orchid and actually any type of plant if you think about it. How to deal with an orchid that lost its roots? Well, it's pretty easy. I'll share with you an info card right here on the screen, and also in the description below some links to how I like to deal with orchids that lost their roots due to various reasons. I think the chances of saving orchids that somehow remained without roots are pretty high, provided the orchid does have enough energy to produce a new root system. So if you'd like to see how I usually handle cases like this, just check the info card or the description below. Now, there is an instance in which root rot is not necessarily a symptom. Sometimes the velamen of the root can get infected with something that can travel through the root up to the axis. However, it is my belief that this rarely happens. Because think about it, if we have an infected leaf with a rotting spot or a bacterial infection, we need to cut into healthy tissue because the infection spreads into the axis and so on. However, when we're dealing with an orchid that has suffered from root rot, we don't need to cut anything into healthy tissue. We just cut away the dead roots and pretty much that's it. Also, if you noticed, many roots seem to be rotten halfway or in certain spots. In any case, the loss of the root system doesn't necessarily mean that the stem will be affected as well. But theoretically, infection of the root that can travel to the axis is possible. I just happen to believe it's very rare. Alrighty, now let's talk about crown rot. And I'm not picking stem rot because I believe crown rot is an easier disease, and I'll tell you why. So crown rot, like the name suggests, affects the crown of an orchid. Crown rot is more frequent in monopodial orchids, but it can happen to sympodial orchids as well. Like the name suggests, crown rot is an infection that starts with the crown of an orchid. The upper core of the orchid gets infected with the disease, so here we're not actually talking about a symptom but more of the disease itself. Why does it happen? Well, the easiest explanation is that water pooled in the crown and that favored the accumulation of bacteria and fungi that started to affect the crown. However, if you go more in depth, there is a more complicated process that happens. So if you notice, the leaves are protected by a cuticle. This prevents pathogens from entering the system of an orchid. Also, water slides right off from the cuticle. This is the protection mechanism of an orchid. So just because there is some water at some point in the crown or in the leaf joints or on the leaves does not mean that you will necessarily get rotting. If you manage to get water in the crown, you can get away with it if you remove it and make sure that everything is dry. But with crown rot, what happens is that water pools in the center and actually affects the cuticle, and all it takes is a little bit of a bruise for the water to penetrate into the underlayers, and together with water, bacteria and other pathogens will penetrate as well. And pretty much this is where everything goes wrong. If pathogens penetrate the cuticle and gets into the flow system of the orchid, that's when the infection starts. Now, because we grow our orchids upright and not on a side like they would naturally grow, water does tend to pool in the crown. And the more water stays in the crown, the more it is likely to produce a micro wound that can get infected, leading to crown rot. For this reason, it is advisable never to let water pool in the center of an orchid. And here we have an orchid suffering from crown rot. Without going into too much detail, crown rot, as the name suggests, affects the crown of the orchid. Luckily, we can stop the infection, and it's easy to stop the infection because we know the entry point. We know that something happened right here in this area, and we also know that the infection can only go downwards. So with this information in mind, logically we need to treat this area. Now I have a video on this orchid, how I treated it, how I stopped the infection, and you can see the result is a little cakey here. So I'm not going to talk about this, but if you're interested in seeing that video, I'll add it in an info card and also the link in the description below. So in most cases, if you manage to stop the infection at the crown level without letting it go down into the axis, your orchid is pretty much safe, in the sense that the lower axis will not be affected, so the orchid will be able to produce roots still and also to propagate through keikis. So for this reason, crown rot is not necessarily the killer disease, because if you spot it in time and manage to stop it, the orchid does have alternatives to still go on. However, of course, it is best to avoid it, so make sure there is never a pool of water in the crown. If you manage to get a bit of water, that's okay. Just make sure you remove it with a paper towel and keep the orchid ventilated so the water evaporates. With sympodial orchids, this is not necessarily an issue because they have pseudobulbs and pretty much a few leaves on top. Water dries off much faster because you don't have as many layers, and also if the infection manages to get to the pseudobulb, all you need to do is cut away the infected pseudobulb and pretty much you're done. So the problem lays with monopodial orchids, not necessarily sympodial orchids. And lastly, stem rot or axis rot. This affects only monopodial orchids because sympodial orchids don't have axes. The equivalent might be pseudobulb rot or rhizome rot, but you can easily resolve that by cutting the affected pseudobulb or rhizome. So we're only going to focus on monopodial orchids here, specifically Phalaenopsis orchids, Vanda orchids, and others. So stem rot, like the name suggests, is the infection of the actual stem of the orchid. It doesn't happen in the crown, and it doesn't happen at a root level. It can happen at any point of the stem. But where is the entry point? Well, this is pretty hard to determine, and this is why stem rot is more severe in my opinion than crown rot. So again, what happens is that the cuticle of the orchid, which actually extends on the stem as well, gets bruised and gets infected with some pathogens. The infection starts somewhere on the stem, and it can either go up or go down or in both directions. The result is the death of the axis. Now, because the axis is dead, theoretically the orchid is completely dead as well. The axis is where leaves sprout, where roots sprout, where keikis and flower spikes sprout. If the whole axis is affected, pretty much the orchid is unsavable. Even if it has a few more roots, they will eventually die. Even if some of the leaves are still holding on, they will eventually die as well because their formation point is affected. If the whole axis is gone, the crown will be gone as well. So pretty much there is no way to escape stem rot if all of the parts of the orchid that are responsible with propagation, with roots, and with leaf formation are affected. So how do we treat this disease? Well, I'm afraid I don't have an elegant method for that, simply because I don't know where entry points are. With crown rot, we knew that we had to treat the top. With root rot, we knew that we had to remove the dead roots and treat the remaining roots. With stem rot, however, we can start to peel off leaves one after the other, but I don't think you will find the entry point. So we need to treat the entire stem. How do we treat the entire stem if we cannot find the entry point to actually add our solutions there? And you can see what the problem is. Luckily, stem rot can actually die off on its own in some cases, or by treating everything, you can actually treat the entry point as well. So in some cases, orchids can survive stem rot if you're lucky enough. But in many cases, and especially if the infection is advanced enough, you will not be able to save your orchid. And I did have quite a few comments lately about stem rot, and already the orchids were too far gone to be saved. So I have an example here of a stem rotting at the base, as you can see. Whatever you see green is not affected tissue, and I believe the infection stopped. However, the problem now is, where will this orchid put out roots? This part of the stem is a little bit too high to be able to produce roots, and this part of the stem, which can produce roots, looks rather dead to me. So the problem right now is, how will this orchid go on without roots? So for this reason, I'm not giving this particular orchid too many chances to survive, even though right now it's looking green. However, I try to maintain water escaping through the leaves. The truth is the same. This orchid has no energy to produce new foliage, no space to produce new roots, and of course no space to produce a basal keiki. My only chance with this orchid is that the axis is not completely affected, and somewhere on the axis this orchid could produce another root. If this doesn't happen though, this orchid is pretty doomed, even though right now it doesn't look like it's completely dying. Soon enough, it might. And here I have another example of a stem rot orchid. This is, however, in the beginning of the disease. Now you can see that the leaves start to yellow from the base right here, and this is because the axis around it is affected. Also, the leaf affected is not the bottom leaf, so in this case I'm not dealing with a normal shedding of leaves. This is clearly a sign of stem rot. Also, if I show you the stem, you'll be able to properly see the infection. And here it is. Do you see the blackening of the stem? Well, I tried to treat this orchid, however, the infection did not stop. So at this point, I am not sure what I can do anymore unless I use a systemic fungicide, but I'm not okay with using that substance, and also that is not 100% foolproof as well. But this one, I will hope that the infection stop on its own, or I will try to remove the layers of sheaths, the joints of the leaves actually, and try to find the entry point. However, this is easier said than done. So with this orchid again, I'm not sure how successful I will be. And you can see now why I cannot give an elegant treatment for stem rot. So the best method against this disease is to try to prevent it, and prevention is not hard to obtain. What you need to do is to make sure that the leaf joints are dry and you don't let water pool in the leaf joints, just like with crown rot. Also, make sure that your orchid is not potted in too deep. All the leaves need to be on top. All the leaf joints again need to be on top. If they're too buried in the medium, when you water it, the joints will accumulate water and stem rot can start from there. So alrighty, these were the 3 types of rotting diseases that usually affect our orchids. You can also have spots on the leaves that are infected, but that's pretty easy to treat, and I have a video down below if you're interested in something like that. So I hope you will be successful in avoiding this disease, and I hope you enjoyed this little discussion. If you did, just leave a rating down below, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more orchid videos and more orchid discussions. Always feel free to leave me comments down below if you have questions or suggestions for videos. I always check my comments, and if you ever want to send me a letter, do so at the address you see on the screen or in the description below. Choose an option on the screen if you'd like to visit my website orchidnature.com or watch another video. Thank you for joining. I'll see you all next time. Bye!